I want to move over to back to Jenny and Allison in Washington now. And I'm conscious of the time moving on. I want to make sure we have enough time for questions and comments from you and from our online audience. But Jenny, maybe I could start with you. In this issue of the exchange, we also were lucky to get an article from Damien Lilly, who was formerly with UNMISS in South Sudan. And he's focused on these protection of civilian sites, which is a new sort of term in the humanitarian lexicon, as he says. These sites that arose when the crisis erupted in South Sudan and civilians started seeking protection at UN mission sites. And I just wondered whether you think there are any lessons to be learned regarding the protection of civilians from this experience as well as from other peacekeeping contexts. I think, Alison, both of you said that there are some examples of promising developments, but is there anything you can say about either the specific example or others that you're aware of? We'll start with Jenny and then maybe Alison can add.
Sure. Maybe just very briefly, Wendy. I mean, I guess in my view, on one hand, UNMISS is performing, did perform an essential function in permitting people to find safe haven within their compounds. But I have to say, I find overall the POC sites and the conditions and how the sites are managed really exemplify a failure of cooperation between the humanitarian community and UNMISS. In fact, I would look, all the points I raised earlier about the importance of proactively shaping and managing the relationship still, need attention in South Sudan. Need much more work in order to avoid the situations that we now have in the POC sites in South Sudan. If I were to draw maybe some broader lessons from the context of South Sudan, I think there's a few things. One is, let's keep in mind that the situation in South Sudan was preceded by a few years of a very, very positive political narrative about, the brand new day in the brand new country. And to a certain extent, I fear that an insistence on a very cheerful political narrative about South Sudan suppressed and, allowed us all to ignore what, the political tensions that in fact continue to simmer in South Sudan. And I think we've experienced this now in more than one instance. We fell into this trap in Afghanistan. We fell into this trap, I would say, in Libya, and in a couple of other cases, perhaps Iraq, you could put in this category. And, it seems to me that in a context like CAR, there may be a temptation to, once some progress has been made, once some basic institutions and functions of government, have been more fully established, there may be a similar temptation to sort of tie it up with a nice bow and say, okay, so we did it and now it's on the right path. But let's not do that in the case of CAR. Let's continue to keep a very sharp eye on actual, the actual conditions in the country, the actual risk patterns facing the civilian population, the actual degree of cohesion and reconciliation that Anthony described, and so on. I think the second lesson from South Sudan relates to a point that Veronique raised regarding the partiality or impartiality of the mission. On one hand, efficacy in terms of protection of civilians, I believe, does require impartiality on the part of the mission, and certainly this is as true in CAR as it was in South Sudan. And part of the reason I believe we're in the situation we are now in South Sudan is in part due to the lack of impartiality on the part of the mission. And of course, this has an effect on whether and how humanitarians engage with the mission, and what can reasonably be expected as a positive contribution to the protection of civilians, given the posture of the mission. Lastly, just in terms of having a realistic sense of mission capacity and resources, as Alison described, in the midst of multiple tasks, 29 of which are considered priorities. Engaging in some hard-nosed scenario-based planning to think through what eventualities we should be prepared for in a context like CAR. The last thing I just want to note, specific to the CAR, and this is something that's worth Security Council attention and mission attention. On one hand, there's a real need, and I think this is well understood and agreed, that prioritization is the essence in terms of aligning the capacity and resources of the mission and of the humanitarian operations to comprehensively and strategically deal with the main risk factors affecting the civilian population. At the same time, I wonder a bit, and in fact, I think it would be interesting to hear Alison's views on this, in terms of synchronizing different kinds of tasks on the part of the mission and linking this up with the efforts of the humanitarian community. So, for example, what is the relationship between policing, setting up, or enabling an environment where there is some judicial process, if there are arrests, who's responsible for them, will they have access to courts, et cetera, et cetera. And also the relationship with DDRR, and whether or not the missions and humanitarians come together in a comprehensive strategy. So if we view protection of civilians as not just the deterrence of an attack against a population at risk, but we look at establishing a series of conditions that actually enable a more stabilized environment for the protection of civilians, what does that actually entail?
Thanks, Jenny. Alison, would you like to add?
Yeah, quickly. I think everyone's aware that the situation in South Sudan right now, we're close to 100,000 people still seeking refuge on UN bases across the country, mostly inside, sometimes adjacent to, and this really creates a challenge for peacekeeping that they haven't had to deal with before. I think a couple lessons learned. One is that it was, in my opinion, very correct for the Security Council to temporarily strip the mandate of UNMISS of its state building responsibilities, as there was no partner, but also because the parties were involved in the level of atrocities that they were. I think that's a good lesson. It is a way to essentially sequence or phase in the middle of a crisis. It shows flexibility politically. I think whether the mission and how the mission is going to achieve this is another question. The second thing I want to talk about is resources. Now, ideally, I would love it if peacekeeping operations could deploy wherever threats are being faced in a country, but that simply just isn't possible. And even with all of the resources being refocused on protection of civilians, I believe that the priority has to be protecting the people inside these bases as far as the peacekeeping operation is concerned, then to try and help facilitate them getting out to livelihoods and essential services outside of the bases. Only then are they going to be able to get out to try and secure environments outside of those bases, and it is still, I think we're far away from being able to secure environments for people to return home. I was just there a few weeks ago conducting focus groups inside of the IDP camps in Juba, and it's very apparent that the individual and collective trauma and some of the other motivations of why people are in these camps are not going to change anytime soon. And while some people may be interested in returning and relocating, that is not the case for the large majority of people. Just one last thing is I think we also need to really learn what is protecting these people. So while there is the use of force that peacekeeping operation is applying as a deterrent, the reason why they're protected in part is because of the status of forces agreement, which sort of creates areas that the government is not supposed to enter. Whereas the enclaves in Central African Republic are a very different situation. And so we need to be looking at alternatives for how we can get parties to the conflict to agree on safe areas so that neither one of them is trying to enter. And of course that will require extreme pressure and will have to come in larger political negotiations to negotiate these safe areas, so it's not just dependent on a status of forces agreement.
Thanks very much, Alison. Andre, I'll let you have the last word, and then I'm going to open up the floor for the audience.
Okay, since it's the last word, I'll be very quick, and I'll resist the temptation to talk about South Sudan, where I was also country director earlier this year. But in any case, just to go back to the relationship between humanitarian actors and peacekeepers, MSF, as well as Oxfam, as well as the ICRC, have long maintained a strict distinction needs to be observed in a conflict setting in particular, which is where they're deployed a peacekeeping mission, so as to preserve the character of impartiality of humanitarian aid. We long maintain that aid cannot be delivered at the barrel of a gun. We have, to speak about dialogues that we've been having this year, in practical terms, what does this mean? Peacekeeping operations in a place like the Central African Republic have to engage in combat to do their jobs. They kill a lot of people in this process, and a lot of people have died in car. I know over the period of time that I was there for about 2 months, there's no official death tolls that come out about belligerents who are killed as a peacekeeping operation unfolds in Kar up in this point, and there's multiple different groups of peacekeepers and so on and so forth. But we're not talking about numbers in the tens, we're talking about beyond a tenfold magnitude in terms of how many lives were actually taken by peacekeeping forces doing the work that they're there to do. Maintaining that distinction between us and them, and by us I mean humanitarians and them being peacekeepers, who are a part of a larger process that's unfolding. It's very important, that we ask for ourselves, that we think is fabulous, but at the same time, if people are engaged in a combat operation where a checkpoint, we'll say, was extorting money from local populations and NGOs passing through, diverting humanitarian aid or what have you, peacekeepers come to make sure that this problem doesn't happen again. They get in a fight, a couple of people are killed, and then the next day, the same convoy that went to break up the problem is escorting a group of NGOs through an area. It doesn't take people long to start making the link between one and the next. And as peacekeepers are doing a job that is intended to be neutral, when you take up arms and you're in the middle of a conflict, you are a belligerent party in that conflict, even if your intentions are absolutely everything but belligerence. If everything is in the direction of the population, that's fine, but when you fight, you fight. And these are people on the ground on a local level who have that kind of understanding of the world, as any of us would if we were in a situation like this. So I wanted to highlight that point, that while we talk about cooperation, while we talk about impartiality of a peacekeeping mission, we need to talk about impartiality of aid provision, and we need to make sure that we maintain a strict distinction between the two. I'll stop it there.
Thank you very much. Our panelists will have plenty of time to continue to speak, because I'm sure you have lots of questions and comments that you want to make. So now I'm going to open the floor. I've got one question here already from our online audience, which I'm going to start with. And this is from Godfrey, I'm going to massacre your name, I'm sorry. Bia Ruhanga, from East and Central Africa, human rights consultant and political analyst. Godfrey says, how realistic is it to expect MINUSCA to succeed where MISCA, MICOPACs, and their predecessors have failed? So I think that's a question that we can direct at most of our panelists, but let's see if there are any other questions from the audience here or comments. Elizabeth. Yes, and please, if you could identify yourself and...
Elizabeth Blunt, IRIN News. It's linked to that. I wondered if Veronique could be a little bit more specific about what she said on people's perceptions of the different contingents in the peacekeeping, because I think that's also linked to the question.
Thank you. We've got one at the far back of the room here.
My name is Shemi from Lawyers for African Development. My question is, why this violence? Why now? given that these folks have lived together very peacefully for years and years. So why this level of vicious violence, and why now? Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we take one more? Sarah, just wait for the microphone, please.
Hi, thank you very much. Really fascinating discussion, and echo many of the points made by the panel, especially Veronique and Andre's last one as well, about the impartiality of aid delivery. I just wanted to...
Sorry, Sarah, could you just identify yourself?
I'm sorry. Sarah from the International Committee of the Red Cross. Yes, my question was really about MINUSCA as a tool with an endpoint in mind, and that really it shouldn't be seen as a permanent state of affairs, but what really will protect civilians in the long run is the reintroduction and effective working of state services, and really what the panel think of that, bearing in mind also the importance of impartiality of the mission in combination with that. It's just a slightly complicated issue that I thought maybe the panelists might like to unpack for us, but very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's start with those, and then I'm sure we'll have time for others. I'm actually going to go over to Anthony first, because I wondered if you wanted to respond to the gentleman at the back, his question about the background, since you went into that in some detail in your article.
Yeah. As I said, from our analysis, for decades, as you rightly pointed out, that Muslims and Christians have lived together in relative harmony, and I want to emphasize the kind of relative harmony, and that means that from our analysis that there wasn't a major conflict arising from their faith. That doesn't necessarily mean that there weren't underlying conflict issues already present in the Central African Republic. A lot of the analysis that we did around the time of kind of November to January indicated that, in a way, religion became a reinforcing cleavage in Central African Republic, especially in the northwest. If you look at the emergence of the anti-Balaka groups in the 1980s, they were largely in response to a pastoralist versus agriculturalist livelihoods conflict, especially as the generally Chadian herders came down and used what was thought to be agriculturalist land, and given the lack of state infrastructure, that just amplified the situation to a point where anti-Balaka groups formed to combat this perceived threat of Chadian herders. So, and this is then compounded by the fact that, especially in the northeast, there's lots of marginalisation. It's generally thought that was the poorest region, quite far away from the favoured centre of development, which was Bongi, and that led to increased perceptions of marginalisation. And I think Veronique might want to pick up on a number of the trigger points that have been at play in this current conflict. And I think that there's a number of different factors that influenced that. One of the key ones from kind of my own analysis is that Central African Republic has gone through a number of DDRR processes. And that one led to a kind of proliferation of armed groups who wanted to almost cash in on previous DDR processes, especially in that almost ungoverned northeast region. And then the lack of payment or promised payment from those processes led to the Seleka coalition, that led to the kind of coup in March, and then those atrocities that they then went on to commit led to this cycle of violence and retaliation. And I think the main, probably to answer your question more directly, why this level of violence, I think one of the main factors is perception, which is one of the reasons why we're emphasizing social cohesion. And it comes back to the point that Joseph makes about individuals versus seeing this as an individual problem rather than a community problem, is that individuals are inextricably linked in this conflict to their community. The reason why there is violence, or this type of violence, is because people perceive Muslims as supporting Seleka, and people perceived Christians as supporting anti-Balaka. And then people also perceived anti-Balaka as protectors in some situations and Seleka as protectors in some situations. One of the advantages of mediating through interreligious methods is that we're hoping to address these perceptions. I think that's probably a more focused answer to your question, is why now, why this type of violence, is people's perceptions. It's people's perceptions of their neighbours and their others that has led to this cycle of revenge.
Thanks very much, Anthony. Vera, would you like to address the question about perceptions that Elizabeth
Yeah, and
raised?
I'm just going to add some to what Anthony was saying about the triggers. I think there's also a changing regional dynamic in the region for, regarding the Central African Republic, and definitely Chad disengaged from the Bozizé regime. And many believe that kind of allowed the Seleka uprising. And I think that was a key determinant of why now, and what that happened then in 2012. On the perception, maybe I'll take two examples, very specific examples. One is the Chadians being part of MISCA. There were a lot of allegations that the Chadian peacekeeping forces actually allowed some of the Seleka fighters to join them. There were also a lot of negative perceptions around the role of the Chadian government, and therefore whether the Chadian peacekeeping force was actually impartial in being in Central African Republic. And eventually all these criticisms led to Chad disengaging and pulling out the forces from CAR. So that's one example of how that negative perceptions happened. One other one that I think is quite interesting is regarding the French and the Sangaris operation of the French military. And there's a feeling that the French came in September, and later on, or they started to engage from September and came in December, and then disarmed the Seleka in Bangui. And then on 5th December, you have a large-scale anti-Balaka attack on the Muslim population in Bangui. That Muslim population remembers that, and they believe that, or they perceive the French, therefore, as siding with the anti-Balaka. And to be honest, the anti-Balaka had that feeling also when the French came in, that they were there to be supported, by the French troops. Of course, we know that that wasn't the case. However, that now is changing. There is a mounting criticism of the Sangaris operation by the anti-Balaka as well. So these are the kind of perceptions that I'm talking about. And these are not just armed groups having these perceptions, but local populations. So I think these are crucial perceptions. I think I'll let the others.
Okay, I'm going to move to Washington and then come back to London, to Andre in a minute. But Jenny and Alison, I wonder if you wanted to address Godfrey's question as well as to add on to anything else that you wanted to say. He has a supplementary question as well, which is rehatting a mistake as opposed to deployment of a new force?
I'll take that. Jenny's nodding that I'll take that. First, to his first question, there was a very big debate initially about whether to keep African forces, to keep MISCA there and to reinforce them, or to move into a UN peacekeeping operation. And I think it would really deserve a long look at it to see what may have been able to work faster from a security perspective. But one place in which the UN definitely has a comparative advantage is on taking a more comprehensive approach, having a lot more civilian components to them, having a lot more access to resources, even if that's troop and assets because of the way it's set up, but it does tend to move much slower, which is the trade-off. So in that sense, MINUSCA, I think, does have, at this point, of doing better on other fronts, at least, than MISCA had. It also tends to have better joint mission analysis centers, joint operation centers, et cetera, primarily just because there's more resources there for it, and there's more practice in trying to figure out how a multinational deployment can work together. I do want to also address Sarah's question about the endpoint, which is, it's not a question of whether we need the endpoint of political reconciliation at both the national and the local level, whether we need a state that is functioning. The question is who and when those things, who should be doing it and when they can be accomplished. Peacekeeping operations tend to have very short honeymoon periods in which they actually have any leverage over the government, it's usually right after the crisis or when a new government is coming into play. But really, it's donor nations and regional, actors who have a lot more leverage that can move some of those goals along. And when you put it on a peacekeeping operation, sometimes UN member states tend to delegate their responsibilities to the UN peacekeeping operation rather than taking those things on themselves when they may be better placed to move them forward. So again, it's not a question of whether it needs to happen. The question is when the UN peacekeeping operation and whether they should be doing some of these activities.
Thanks. Jenny, go ahead.
Wendy, maybe I'll just add a little bit to Alison's very last point in response to Sarah and the challenge of impartiality in a context where presumably ultimately, a government performing state functions, it comes into being. And I think that agreeing very much with Alison's point, placing emphasis on the diplomatic functions of other governments in support of a process, but contextualizing within that what then is the role of MINUSCA, and viewing their role in terms of supporting a process as opposed to supporting this actor or that actor. And I think the degree to which they can establish their benchmarks and their tasks in an impartial sense, whereby they are able to play a facilitating role, and the local actors, national actors, play the primary decision-making role that steer the process. I think that's absolutely essential. It's an extremely fine line, and every single context is going to be different. And indeed, how that balance actually plays out in a given context is going to shift constantly over time. So it's I would say, an almost daily exercise of calibration and recalibration of how to facilitate support and manage a process.
And that sounds like a very dynamic process. And I guess the next question is whether a big mission like that has the agility to be able to do that on a regular basis.
Go ahead.
We have found that large peacekeeping operations, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay. We found that large peacekeeping operations tend not to be very flexible and not be very dynamic, and I think that's one of, South Sudan is a very good case of how the mission wasn't adapting to a deteriorating situation over a number of years before the current crisis, and the fact that they've now shifted gears into a new mandate that's very focused on protection of civilians is very radical for peacekeeping operations. So no, I don't think that they are very good at being dynamic and keeping up with some of these movements. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't be involved in some way, but the question is how.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Andre, did you want to?
Well, I was just going to add a few points about the past and drivers of conflict within the country. I mean, when I went there in 2006, it was due to conflict that was ongoing in the country, and I was working in one context where there was a particular rebel group fighting against the Bozize government, who was affiliated with Patasse, who was his predecessor. In another part of the country, there was a different group already also fighting with the government at the same time. And in the northeast, there was another separate group that was also fighting. I met people in refugee camps in Chad that I then met who were leaders or on a certain degree within the anti-Balaka movement, and so on and so forth. So you had a ton of drivers of conflict that were already in place. Now, this particularly vicious turn that the conflict took as it unfolded, this is completely new. The nature of the violence, the kind of violence that was being perpetrated, and the scale was much broader. But all the drivers were there for a long, long time, and everyone was well aware of this. In addition to the comments on the end point, it's important for people to understand, too, that for this peacekeeping mission, the conflict is not over. People are still fighting with one another on the ground right now, and it's developing, it's changing in ways. We've seen sporadic fighting from within the Seleka groups fighting against one another in recent times. And regarding protecting civilians and civilian protection centers, people are being attacked outright and overtly. And when you're talking about trying to deploy troops in whatever number you have into a location, and you have a regroupment of population that's relatively dispersed over a large chunk of land, that takes a lot of people to do that. Given the fact that that's going to take a lot of people, that you have larger, more strategic points like Bangui and some of the other larger population centers, and then that much of the violence is being perpetrated on a village level off in the bush, it's a pretty huge mandate. And I'm afraid that the expectations going along with this could potentially work against it. If people really expect it to deliver on all of these fronts all at the same time. A last point just on perception on actors from both sides. It was mentioned that people had perceived the Sangaris when they had arrived to be siding with the anti-Balakas. Well, if you were on the other side of the line, they would have perceived it the other way around, actually. And this was just a point that I had heard constantly from both sides as we crossed the front line of the conflict and going into different areas, that this is exactly what every side accuses the peacekeepers of doing, which sort of further reinforces the necessity of the distinction in these peacekeeping operations from humanitarian work, which needs to have that flexibility to cross those front lines. So I just wanted to work in a little point on the perception still.
Thank you, Andre. The gentleman here had a question.
Yes, my name is Peter Trash. I'm with the Mauritanian Embassy in London. One remark for Anthony. You talk about Chadian herders, but I wouldn't call them Chadian herders. They're herders who move from one side of the border to the other side of the border and live half year here and half year there. They're Pearl Fulani. That's their identity, not Chadian. And I think that should be, this has been used to argue that this is foreign intervention. I attended a meeting last week in London, where a very high French director of foreign affairs was speaking to an audience, and he was using language which reminded me about the new Sahelian force, which was nearly the same as the language he used for the intervention in Chad. He was talking in specific relation in Chad was still according to him, a jihadist, Janjaweed, Seleka, threat, all thrown in one. Jihadist, Seleka, and Janjaweed, whoever the Janjaweed are. So, I mean, and I found that the way he was talking, complete disconnect with what I'm hearing today. And I don't know where the truth is, But I mean, this is a problem, and the language was used, and I'll finish on that. The language that was used in November, and also in this country, by esteemed member of the House of Lords, Baroness Cox. She was talking about the Janjaweed threat of rapes and all that kind of thing, and that was the intervention. That was the reason, the letter for the intervention, which resulted in a displacement of the Muslim population of different ethnic groups who were not there for decades, but for centuries in this in what became the latter Central African Republic. So, we need to contextualize a bit more without these geopolitical arguments which are used by the great powers today.
Thanks for that. That's an interesting point about the choice of words, the language, what perceptions that creates as well. I'm neglecting the other side of the room, so I'm going to go over here to this gentleman in the back.
Thank you. This is Caesar from Conciliation Resources. Just an observation on the issue of relocation. To what extent do we not run a risk of facilitating relocation as reinforcing the movement of Muslims up north and dividing the country into two? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then I think we had a question here. Our online audience is being a bit quiet now.
David Curran from Coventry University Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations. It's a comment followed by a question. Thanks, Alison, for your rundown on protection of civilians. It's very interesting seeing how this is going to play out, in a sense, in the Central African Republic. And it links to some of the... I was in New York around the time of the C-34, the Special Committee on Peacekeeping Operations, and protection of civilians at a political level in the United Nations isn't fully agreed upon. It's there are troop contributing states, some of the larger ones that appear to be holding back much more on POC. And also, with the OIOS report, the Office of Internal Oversight, into use of force to protect civilians in operations, it does show that UN peacekeeping operations, when deployed, shouldn't be seen, at least the military component, as white horses riding over the hill. There's going to be a lot of problems on that direct protection. And that links to this links to the question on the fundamental nature of the political process and the role of political elites in the transitional government, because without that, protection of civilians might turn into what was happening in South Sudan, which was a short-term measure that's been stretched out, where you've got safe areas and a mission that may not have the full consent of the host government, and that's not a very good place for a peacekeeping operation to be. And with that in mind, how realistic are elections going to be and the timetable that have been set up for February, and that political process, how much can it actually support the peacekeeping mission?
Thank you. I'm going to take one at the back here, Mark. And then we'll...
Hi, Mark Dubois. First, thanks to the panel. A very interesting discussion. I wanted to go back to the caption there, prioritizing the protection of civilians, and maybe just a brief comment. We seem to, the discussion seems to have sort of descended into a talk about peacekeeping and protection. Where are the NGOs in this? At least at this stage of discussion, I heard a lot about it from the panelists. So, but it's just is it too easy that we fall into talking peacekeepers? The second question is, to what extent, we're talking about prioritizing the protection of civilians. Does anyone on the panel see that by prioritizing protection, we actually end up, and in particular aid agencies on the ground, end up displacing or ignoring aid, aid activities? That it is much easier in some ways to run around the ground, produce reports, monitor situations, talk to people about protection issues, than it is to actually get food, medicine, blankets, things like that out into areas. And there's no inherent contradiction between the two. I would have said inherently they have to work hand in hand. Mm. But in actual fact, what are agencies doing? Are they showing we're engaged in CAR, and are they delivering aid, or are they engaged in protection activities? And I don't mean that to belittle protection activities, but just to get back to what Andre was talking about, MSF's point of view. By the way, I'm no longer an MSF, so please don't attribute anything I say to MSF. But just, where in a country without aid, do you have to prioritize protection and aid?
Thanks, Mark. Provocative question, as usual. And we had a person here in the front, and then we're going to stop. And then we're going to have very brief comments from our panelists after that, because we'll need to wind up.
Hi, my name's Claire Grant, and I work for CAFOD. A lot has been brought up today about impartiality. Obviously, that's one of our humanitarian mandates that we hold very closely to. But I'm quite interested in thinking about this aspect of impartiality in the context of CAR at the moment, and whether it is in fact possible for us as aid agencies to gain an apolitical flag in the work that we do. And I'm interested as well just to ask the question, is it actually possible in this context for us to gain humanitarian access? And if not, how do we go about distinguishing between peacekeepers and us as well as humanitarian actors whenever it is such a volatile context? And by the very essence of being apolitical, we ourselves are part of the situation where conflicts arising between the two sides. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, I'm going to go back to Washington, to Alison and Jenny, and just ask you if there's any of those, for any of those questions, if you'd like to comment on them, and don't feel that you have to address all of them, but just your final words. Jenny?
Sure. Yes, I'm going to pick up the gauntlet that Mark has dropped on the floor. On prioritizing protection, I think first of all, from my perspective, protection and aid are not separate things. and it's it draws a false distinction, I would say, to speak of protection as being separate from services and aid, which indeed are intended to save lives and alleviate human suffering. The goal of protection is the same, to save lives and alleviate human suffering. So I would tend to agree, we too easily jump into a peacekeeping conversation and we neglect our roles as humanitarians as it relates to achieving an overall protection result or outcome from our efforts. And I have to say, I've become, increasingly, filled with feelings of despair at, our inability to articulate what is the desired outcome of this humanitarian response. We seem to be resisting firmly articulating what result we intend to bring about as a result of our interventions, if you're comfortable using that word, and how we think that our specific contributions, in combination with the contributions of other actors operating across multiple sectors, is meant to bring about the outcome of enhanced protection of civilians. What benchmarks do we attach to that, and so on. So I resist the notion that protection means monitoring and running around writing reports. I would like to see much more concrete and practical action against an articulated desired result, that we can help to bring about through our efforts. So along these lines, I think we need to be extremely careful about using the word protection as a verb, or suggesting that we are providing protection as humanitarians. And I would argue the same is true for peacekeeping missions. In fact, we cannot protect in the true sense of the word in terms of establishing the conditions of comprehensive protection. Only those who hold formal obligations vis-a-vis the civilian population can do that. Those are the state and the non-state parties. What we can do is affect the dynamics that are putting populations at risk and help to bring about conditions whereby those who do hold those formal obligations are meeting them. And at the very least, refraining from attacking a civilian population, refraining from causing deliberate harm. So, as humanitarians, what is our contribution to ensure that that result is brought about? And in the meantime, anyone who does suffer as a consequence of the conflict, as a consequence of being targeted, is properly looked after, and that the obligations in that sense are met. So I couldn't agree more that, prioritizing protection should not mean neglecting aid. It's part and parcel of the same strategy in order to bring about the desired result. And I'd like to see much more strategic and comprehensive thinking at the level of the broader humanitarian response strategy for that purpose.
Thanks, Jenny. Alison.
I actually disagree with Jenny a little bit on this. I actually think that protection is a verb, and that peacekeeping operations are one of the few, whether that's a multilateral UN, an African Union, a unilateral intervention, that actually can provide protection from physical violence. And I actually think we need a better definition of what protection means for peacekeeping, which is that primarily it is about protection from physical violence, but that's not just done through physical force, that that's done through political conflict and negotiation, mediation, reconciliation at both the strategic and the local level, that there are economic steps that can be taken. And then very separately, we need to be thinking about what are the other environment building tasks that a peacekeeping operation does in order to establish all of the other conditions. And that within each of those, whether it be elections or it be extension of state authority, that the protection lens that has to be put on those is that you're contributing to ensuring that you're contributing to avoiding physical violence and that you are not doing any harm. We know that elections and state building activities can actually contribute to violence against civilians, not just undermine it in the short term. Speaking to the OIOS report that was brought up, in my opinion, it was far too focused on the use of force, but it does make a good argument for why we need to be pushing peacekeeping operations and member states who are resistant to this to be focusing on protection from physical violence and to be talking about how that is more than just use of force.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Veronique now and ask everybody to be extremely brief because we're out of time. So please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to focus mostly on the relocation issue. I think this is something that the international community really thought about and the humanitarians really thought about. However, the situation was that you had a population under imminent threat of being massacred. And so the question of whether you were playing into dividing the country or not kind of maybe took a little bit of a... I think they tried to mitigate as much as possible this issue, at the same time realizing that there was a real humanitarian imperative to act timely on this relocation. And actually, I think a lesson that could be drawn from relocation in Central African Republic is that this political agenda around whether this was, playing into the division of the country or not, delayed an intervention that was needed in any case, and led to people spontaneously trying to leave those besieged areas and getting killed, as well as families being separated. So the result was not, a delayed intervention, basically. So I think it is a dilemma. It is something that was not considered lightly, but ultimately I think the humanitarian imperative took over, and that's a good thing, and the right decision was made.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give Anthony and Andre a minute and a half each, and then we're going to have to close.
Okay, that's
Thank you.
I'll be very quick, and I want to address the first comment first, and it is a very important point that you raise. In our analysis and also the analysis of the International Crisis Group, the groups that are travelling on that pastoralist route are generally described as and seen as by the population as from Chadian and Sudanese origin. That being said, it's a very important point based on the perceptions in the country, as from the start of the crisis, Muslims in particular were always seen as foreign. And I think that is part of this playing back into the perception problem, is that was dangerous, and that also increased the conflict, and it was a driver of conflict. Similarly, increasingly, we're seeing that distinction being made within the Muslim community itself, which is also really worrying, and this links back to the point about the political process, is that it's unlikely that elections will be in February. And before that happens, we need to facilitate and ensure that there are conditions for safe return of Muslim populations. I think that is the key, and that's kind of why reconciliation needs to start to happen now, in parallel with all of these overprotection processes about addressing the root causes of conflict and the physical disarmament of militia groups. But a greater focus needs to be on social cohesion now to actually facilitate that political process.
Thank you. Andre.
Okay, just to close, you were wanting further contextualization of sort of the character of the violence that's happening now. Just recently, we had one day in Bangui alone where we received 31 victims of violence over a course of about 12 hours. There's still fighting in the PK5 neighborhood down there. There's fighting at PK12 neighborhood as well. We had a team pinned down under heavy gunfire for the course of basically an entire day while they fought it out. Before that, 10 days, we had another massacre take place in the city of Mambari. 10 days prior to that, there was an additional massacre that took place there. 10 days prior, there was a church where there was an attack in it with 17 wounded. 10 days prior to that, or 10 days after that, there was 5 people in another village burnt. Every single day, there's more villages being burnt on the outside. It's still ongoing. It's still unraveling, and it's absolutely chaotic. It's a huge mess. Regarding impartiality and aid provision, yes, it is possible to provide impartial humanitarian aid in a conflict environment. It's not entirely possible for a peacekeeping force to be viewed as neutral by warring parties within such a circumstance. But aid actors must strive to do so, and we do it every day. Get out and do impartial assessments. That means outside, unaffected by the political forces that are at work, assessments of the humanitarian situation, and deliver aid to those who are in the most need as opposed to those who fulfill certain political criteria or categories. I'd like to keep on cracking on the list of questions, but I'm going to spare you.
I'm really sorry to have to cut you off. But we have run out of time. But I just wanted to thank everybody, especially our panelists, Alison and Jenny in Washington, Veronique, Anthony and Andre here in London, and those of you who are watching online as well as those of you in the room. I think we've had a really interesting discussion. There is a lot more that can be said. I hope you'll read the rest of the articles in the exchange. They're not all focused on protection. It's quite a broad church, if I can use that word, of different types of themes. So thank you again for coming, and please join us for refreshments outside, those of you in the room. Thank you.